Hi, thank you, Joe, Oren, and all panelists and everyone on the call. My name is Sarah Lewinger, and I'll be co-presenting with my co-authors, Cody Freeman and Cai Thomas. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And if you're a participant, please click on Cody Freeman's screen and select Pin Video to show our PowerPoint presentation in full screen mode. We highly encourage you to participate throughout, and there will be times that we directly ask you to engage with us. So feel free to enter your name and pronouns into the chat box. Next slide, please. Researchers and practitioners have expressed a clear desire to address the barriers to LGBT inclusive education. Literature discusses high levels of bullying, harassment, and victimization of LGBT+ students and calls for teachers to create safer, more inclusive communities of learning. In our belief that sustainable social change begins at the local level, we conducted what is, to the best of our knowledge, the first systematic literature review on teachers' perspectives on discussing LGBT+ topics in their classroom. And we use LGBT+ to entail all queer identities. So topics in their classroom meaning as part of the formal and informal curricula, encompassing aspects such as classroom discussions. So to reach Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all by 2030, teachers have a responsibility to provide equal opportunities by ensuring that the classroom is a space for all learners and that the content discussed reflects that. Through cultivating a more nuanced understanding of teachers' perspectives on LGBT inclusive education, we aim to reconfigure how we advocate for the inclusion of LGBT topics in primary and secondary education. Next slide, please. Our research questions are as follows. What empirical research exists on K-12 or primary and secondary teachers' perspectives on addressing LGBT+ topics? What key barriers and facilitators can be discerned from the available studies? And to what extent do these barriers and facilitators vary in different sociocultural contexts? Next slide. We utilize a theoretical framework based on the pedagogy of discomfort, which emphasizes the connection between teachers' emotions and their abilities to be agents of positive social change, along with the theory of curricular justice, which stresses the need for educational strategies that produce greater equality in the societies in which the schools are embedded. So for the pedagogy of discomfort to be transformative, it requires critical inquiry with discomforting emotions. And curricular justice is a transformative process of restructuring social norms through the inclusion and validation of marginalized groups in the curricula. By focusing on the root causes of teachers' resistance, we hope to open new possibilities for educators to engage with their emotions on LGBT+ topics and eventually implement curricular justice in their own classrooms. Cai, I think you're going to jump in with methodology. Oh, yeah, okay, cool.
Sorry, I was on mute, of course.
No worries.
All right, so to review the current literature on K-12 teachers' perspectives on addressing LGBT+ topics in their classroom, we conducted a preliminary search of 2 purposely selected databases, IREX and Google Scholar. This resulted in 33 articles. We used unstandardized search terms. And then in September of 2019, Sarah conducted a systemic review of the same 2 databases using the following search terms: LGBT, education, attitudes, beliefs, teacher, and classroom. This systemic review yielded 21 articles. 7 additional articles were identified through cross-referencing bibliographies and selected articles. So in total, our systemic review allowed us to identify 28 articles that met our criteria for inclusion, which were empirical research published in peer-reviewed journals from 2008 to 2019, written in English, examining primary and secondary teachers, including pre-service teachers, and looking at their perspectives on incorporating LGBT+ topics into their formal and informal curricula. So we found 2008, 2019 as a relevant time period to look at this work. We found 2008 as a shift in global discourse around LGBT rights around the world. Here in the US, we saw the most pro-LGBT president elected here, President Obama. In Australia, we saw that they enacted protections for same-sex couples to have the same rights as opposite-sex couples. And we saw Turkey, majority Muslim country, hold its first gay pride parade. So we did 2 rounds of reading. The first one was to identify themes in coding. And our second round, after we identified the most salient themes, each author, Cody, Sarah, and myself, we reread the articles with that theme in mind and noted where these themes emerged. So of course, there were limitations to our study, predominantly being that most of our research is from the Western context, where LGBT plus individuals have more acceptance. And there's really a dearth of research in LGBT inclusive education practices in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So our findings don't necessarily apply to those contexts, although we did find some cross-cutting themes that transcend borders. This research also is limited to studies published in English. There could be other studies that are existing in other languages on this topic. So in an effort to engage with the audience, before we jump into our findings, we wanted to ask the audience, what do you think are the top 3 common barriers and facilitators that teachers face when addressing LGBT plus topics in education? So please enter your thoughts, your ideas into the chat box. We'll give you about 30 seconds. We really want this to be participatory and engaging with our audience. So from Annabelle, we got lack of awareness of LGBT experience. From Andrew, we got lack of training. Stigma, concerns over negative responses from parents and administrators, lack of training resources. From teachers, pushback from administration, feeling like they don't know anything, worry about students' receptiveness. Wow, thank you. It sounds like all of you are pretty engaged with this topic. So we're gonna jump in and show you what our findings found. So from the 28 articles that fit our inclusion for criteria, we had 7 countries where we used research from: Australia, Canada, Israel, Italy, South Africa, Turkey, and the United States. And the 3 cross-cutting themes that we found were, number 1, fear of backlash from parents, community, and school leadership for teaching LGBT plus content. The second one was teacher identity. Now, identity was ranging from religious identity to being a member of the LGBT community to their cultural identity, but in specific, one question emerged, and that was, what is the identity of the teacher? And more specifically, what is the teacher's role? And then the third cross-cutting theme was a lack of knowledge and comfort with teaching LGBT plus issues stemming from an absence of familiarity and training. So a lot of you in this group really identified some of our key findings that we found in the literature.
So the first cross-cutting theme, which I'll address, is fear of backlash. So throughout many of the articles, teachers discussed how fear of backlash prevents them from being able to discuss LGBT plus topics in their classrooms. Out of the 28 articles reviewed, 23 articles explicitly discussed this theme. So I have a quotation to share with you to illustrate this theme. The biggest roadblocks include supportive administration, conservative community members, or stakeholders who are not open to discussing differences in LGBTQ plus topics. I am open to teaching LGBTQ plus issues and willing to do it, but I would be one of the few and standing alone. That is scary. So that quote is from a 7th grade social studies teacher in Kentucky, United States, from a 2019 study. So clearly the literature indicates that fear of backlash is a significant barrier that prevents many teachers from incorporating LGBT plus issues into their classrooms. This fear is generally precipitated by the belief that parents and community members would be offended by LGBT topics and that school administrators would be unsupportive of teachers' decision to teach this topic, reprimanding or even firing them as a result. Surveillance from parents, community members, and administrators constitutes what could be called a panoptic modality of power, meaning that teachers perceive themselves to be constantly observed by a harsh and punitive audience, which may cause them to avoid grappling with potentially controversial topics. Fostering a more open dialogue about the importance of teaching LGBT plus topics and just having a more inclusive LGBT classroom environment could be the first step to ameliorating this fear of backlash.
All right, the second theme that we identified was teacher identity. So the major themes within teacher identity that emerged that impacted whether teachers addressed LGBT plus topics in the classroom were religious identity, sexual orientation and gender identity, being a friend of an LGBT plus person, cultural identity, location, being urban versus rural, teaching experience, and the last one, and the one that was the most salient for me, was the teacher themselves identifying what a teacher identity is, what their role as a teacher was. So of the 28 articles we reviewed, 22 articles discuss the theme of teacher identity. And the one quote that I do want to share here is, "I'll sacrifice myself. I am gay. I am proud to be gay. I am proud that I was born gay. If homosexuality is a choice, then this means I'm choosing to live a life of oppression. What makes me especially angry is the argument that only homosexuality is a choice. Why can't heterosexuality be a choice? If I choose to be gay, did you choose to be straight?" The bottom line is that we need to create an open environment for all children to learn and feel validated, with or without scientific evidence. If we choose to ignore one child over the other, we risk compromising a student's academic lifestyle, which is the only lifestyle we should be judging. So this quote was from an elementary education pre-service teacher in the Midwest USA. And I think it speaks to a few things. I think it speaks to the sacrifice that queer teachers often make in the fight for visibility and awareness. They often risk and expose themselves to when in the act of advocating for their students. It also speaks to the job of the teacher, the role of the teacher identity itself, and in terms of how the educator sees their role. This teacher saw themselves as someone who needed to create a safe environment for all students. They were even willing to sacrifice themselves to create that environment. But a lot of teachers that we found throughout the research, they were struggling with their own identity, and so they couldn't address and be responsive to all children in the classroom because their own personal identities impacted their teacher identity.
Hi, everyone. So just one moment as we switch to the presentation screen. If you're a participant, please feel free to right-click on Sarah's screen now and select Pin Video to see the PowerPoint in the full screen mode. Cool, thanks, Sarah. So great. A third key theme that we found in 11 articles was that teachers were not addressing LGBT plus topics in their classrooms due to a lack of knowledge and comfort. And this was primarily as a result of a lack of training. So for pre-service teachers in their colleges of education, and for in-service teachers because of a lack of ongoing professional development and diversity training. And a quote that we feel reflects this theme was from a pre-service language arts teacher in the United States. And she states, "It's not that teachers don't care about those students. I just don't think many of us are that comfortable because we're not that knowledgeable in the area, which might cause us to be more withdrawn when it comes to those discussions. With teachers going down for everything and anything today, I would be apprehensive about unknowingly offending someone and possibly losing my job." So in this quote, we see that this teacher is apprehensive, one, because they don't feel like they would know what content to discuss, but two, they also don't know how to maintain a safe, affirming environment and respond if another student would interject something negative during the lesson. And this teacher also feared punishment. Other teachers in the literature mentioned the dearth of training and preparation on inclusive education, but that currently LGBT topics and students don't necessarily fit the current definition of inclusive education. And therefore there's this huge gap, but also this great opportunity. Next slide, please. So in our paper, we wanted to discover the root causes or barriers for teachers. And in learning about these barriers, our aim was to reconfigure how we advocate for the inclusion of SOGI topics. So from a researcher perspective, There's a great need for future research that, one, includes intersex people and discusses sex characteristics in the curriculum. Two, being a part of the Comparative International Education Society, while we found articles in 7 countries, the literature still mostly is in the American context. And three, most of the studies took place through a kind of case study approach at a given workshop or training or school, and lack comparison for learning and sharing challenges and best practices across contexts. So now that we have a wide range of stakeholders on the call, including researchers and practitioners, we thought it'd be a great start to facilitate conversations between research and practice. And we know that having supportive teachers and staff improves the safety and well-being of LGBT students. Therefore, we advocate to address barriers and facilitators through teacher education programs and ongoing professional development, but not just through teaching about LGBT topics and content, a kind of knowledge-based approach, but imploring teachers to really analyze and embrace LGBT topics in an emotional appeal. So asking them to unpack why they're uncomfortable, why talking about gender and sexuality feels so sensitive to them. And by doing this, we hope it can lead to a higher quality in how we train teachers on these topics. Next slide, please. So for our practitioners and current teachers on the call, if you're interested in addressing LGBT+ topics in your classrooms, but are not exactly sure how, we found 4 key approaches that serve as best practices. These include pedagogy, curriculum, environment, and assessment. If you've had the chance to watch Iveta Solova's welcoming speech to the conference, she shares a quote by Donna Haraway stating, "Stay with the trouble." And further, Iveta encourages us at this conference to sit in the discomfort around these uncomfortable concepts. So with pedagogy, it's about reconceptualizing your role as a teacher, as Cai said, and embracing that discomfort, seeing yourself as a change agent aligned with social justice practices. With curriculum, it's not just talking about LGBT topics, but how do you advance justice by centering marginalized students? This could be through textbooks, through conversations, through classroom material and resources. With environment, we hear great phrases like welcoming schools and school climate, and it's continuing that of creating a safe and inclusive space for all through measurable ways. And assessment. Here we don't mean assessment of students, we're evaluating the success of yourself as a teacher by asking critical questions. So is your classroom an open space where people feel free to ask questions and give feedback? And how can you promote democratic practices like co-creating classroom policies to ensure the equity and equality of all students? So because we want to use this electronic space as a tool for engagement, we want to hear how you're feeling about tackling these recommendations in your work, even if you're not an educator. If you like, you can add a sentence in the chat box, keywords, a picture, an emoji, anything that you feel like would represent your feeling. And while you're doing that, just sensitive of time, we want to express our gratitude to everyone who joined in on the call, and especially the Soji SIG, for ensuring that we can continue to advocate for LGBT people, even when we're on opposite sides of the world. So thank you very much.